The trembling hands caught his attention first. Dr. Marcus Hargrove stood at the nurse's station, coffee cooling in a ceramic mug embossed with his medical school crest, watching the temp agency nurse sign her paperwork with fingers that shook just enough to be noticeable. Her signature wavered across the consent form, Rachel Torres, the nameplate read, and Hargrove's eyes narrowed with the calculating precision of a man who'd built his entire career on reading people's weaknesses. Temp assignment, 7 days maximum. She'd never last. They never did. What he didn't see was the precision with which those same trembling hands would, 40 minutes later, reorganize the trauma crash cart by order of probability rather than alphabetical labeling. He didn't see the way she positioned the 14-gauge needles within centimeter-perfect reach of where a coded patient's chest would rest. He didn't see the legend whose medical charts were still classified in 3 different Pentagon databases, stored in a vault at Walter Reed Army Medical Center under a designation that didn't officially exist. Rachel Torres wheeled the supply cart through Oak Creek Memorial's ER corridor at 6:36 a.m., the fluorescent lights overhead casting everything in a sickly institutional white. Linoleum floors still wet from the night shift's mopping reflected her image back at her, a woman nobody noticed, which was exactly how she'd been ordered to live. Her temp badge hung from a lanyard, navy blue scrubs pressed with meticulous creases, and she kept her eyes on the inventory clipboard, counting gauze packs and for tubing with the kind of methodical attention that used to save lives in places the Pentagon wanted forgotten. The antiseptic smell mingled with burnt coffee from the nurse's station and something else, the copper tang of dried blood on a gurney that housekeeping had missed. Her name had been erased. Her service record sealed. The classified operation in Ramadi 20 years ago, the one where she'd pulled a collapsed building apart with her bare hands to find a child buried in the rubble, that operation never officially happened. 3 governments had made sure of it. They'd given her a choice: disappear quietly, take the small pension, keep her mouth shut, or fight them in courts that didn't have jurisdiction over black operations. She'd chosen invisibility. She'd chosen this, pushing a cart through a hospital in Portland, a senior chief petty officer reduced to a temp badge and trembling hands. Except the hands weren't trembling from fear. They were trembling from restraint. There was a difference that civilians never understood. The tremor came from 20 years of holding things together, holding pressure on wounds, holding soldiers upright when their legs wouldn't work, holding her husband's hand as he died from injuries he'd gotten saving her. Restraint looked like weakness if you didn't know what you were looking at. She reached the crash cart and her movements changed. The trembling stopped. Her hands moved like a surgical laser finding its target. She'd reorganized this cart wrong. All wrong. Alphabetical labeling was how people panicked. In a code, seconds mattered. In a code, muscle memory was the only thing between a patient and the morgue. She began repositioning, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd practiced these movements under fire, literally. The ambu bag came forward. The intubation kit moved to her immediate left. The defibrillator pad shifted to where her right hand could grab them without conscious thought. She placed the needles, 16 gauge, 18 gauge, 14 gauge for the chest, in order of desperation. The way you'd arrange them if someone's lung had collapsed and you had 90 seconds before they died. A nurse walked past, barely glancing at Rachel. Then walked backward, watching the reorganization with something like confusion. "Why are you changing the setup?" Rachel didn't look up. Her voice came out soft, almost apologetic. Probability saves lives faster than alphabetical order. The nurse stared at her. Then shrugged and walked away. Just a temp. Just someone moving supplies. Rachel Torres didn't look like a legend. That was her greatest asset and her deepest wound. She looked like someone who'd lost everything, which was technically true. The combat boots, worn brown leather, laces still tied in military knots, soles cracked from desert operations, sat in her locker wrapped in plastic. She'd tried to leave them at Arlington, at her husband's grave, a dozen times. Couldn't do it. Those boots had walked through Ramadi at 0300 hours. They'd carried her through the collapsed building where she'd found the boy. They were the only part of who she'd been that she'd kept. At 2:14 p.m., Dr. Marcus Hargrove entered the ER with the bearing of a man who owned the space. His watch, a $12,000 Omega Seamaster with a white face and steel links, caught the overhead lights. His tie was Italian silk. His shoes were hand-polished leather that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd built a network so carefully constructed, so strategically positioned, that he'd become essentially untouchable within Oak Creek Memorial's walls. Board members owed him favors. Suppliers paid him commissions on inflated bids. A hospital administrator in his pocket meant that his billings for procedures, sometimes unnecessary, always profitable, never got scrutinized. But something had changed in the last 72 hours. His network, carefully woven over 15 years, had developed a single thread that could unravel everything. Rachel Torres had arrived as a temp. Hargrove had done his homework. No previous employment history before 6 months ago. No references that checked out. No social media footprint. No rental history in Portland. The background check came back clean, too clean, which meant something had been scrubbed, and in Hargrove's experience, people didn't spend that kind of money to erase a background unless they had something worth hiding. Federal Protective Program, maybe. Witness security. Some small-time criminal trying to hide from an ex-spouse. He'd seen it before. What he hadn't anticipated was her accuracy. In the 3 shifts she'd worked, her documentation was flawless. Not good. Not thorough. Flawless. She charted every foreplacement with the exact time, angle, and gauge used. She documented patient vital signs with a precision that made the electronic monitoring system look careless by comparison. She'd caught 2 medication errors before they reached patients, small ones, the kind that wouldn't have killed anyone, but the kind that would have been profitable to bill incorrectly. She'd noted supply costs with meticulous attention. She'd flagged 3 inflated invoices from his preferred medical supplier. 3 invoices. In 3 shifts. That meant she was already looking, already noticing, already seeing the pattern that would take a competent auditor approximately 48 hours to unravel once they understood what to look for. Her documentation would be the proof. Her charts would be the evidence. And in 6 days, when her temp assignment ended, she'd probably walk away and think nothing of what she'd seen. But if anyone, decided to audit Oak Creek Memorial's billing practices, those charts would be sitting in the electronic record system like a roadmap leading directly to him. Hargrove watched her from across the ER as she moved supplies from a delivery box into the medication cabinet. Methodical. Precise. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. He noticed that. The trembling had stopped. She was moving with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst, the kind of composure that suggested she'd face something more frightening than a hospital billing audit. He didn't know who Rachel Torres really was. He had no idea he was looking at a woman who'd coordinated operations involving 214 Marines and 2 Army Ranger teams. He couldn't see the scars hidden beneath her sleeves, the kind of scars that came from shrapnel, not accidents. He couldn't read the military precision in the way she'd reorganized that crash cart, couldn't understand that every movement had been a muscle memory response to training that happened in places that didn't officially exist. But he did know this: she was a threat. Not because she was malicious, but because she was competent, methodical, and worst of all, she was honest. Honest people were dangerous in ways that corrupt people understood instinctively. Hargrove smiled to himself, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. He'd handled bigger problems than a temporary nurse who couldn't stay. He had leverage. He had allies. He had a system that had survived 15 years of careful corruption. One person wasn't going to change that. He was wrong about a lot of things. But the wrongness he didn't see coming was the dog tag still tangled in the jacket of an Army Ranger who'd soon arrive at Oak Creek Memorial's ER bleeding from a motorcycle accident, carrying a name on those tags that would change everything. The Monday morning staff meeting at Oak Creek Memorial began the way they all did, fluorescent lights humming their monotonous drone, coffee growing cold in styrofoam cups, residents and nurses filing into the conference room with the enthusiasm of people heading toward a dental procedure. Rachel sat in the back row, her hands folded on the laminate table, her temp badge clipped to scrubs that still smelled like industrial detergent. She'd worn them 3 days already. Stretched them out a little more each morning. Dr. Hargrove leaned back in his chair at the head of the table, his tailored blazer draped over the seat back like a flag claiming territory. He was the kind of man whose presence felt like a pressure system moving into a room, not commanding, exactly, but oppressive. The kind of calm that comes from knowing you've stacked every deck in your favor. His Rolex caught the overhead lights as he gestured toward the assembled staff. "I'm taking bets," he announced, his voice carrying the tone of someone used to being entertained by his own observations. "How long does the skittish temp last? Any takers?" Laughter rippled through the conference room like a wave. One of the senior nurses smirked into her coffee cup. A resident, couldn't have been more than 28, grinned at his neighbor and murmured something too low to hear but loud enough to land. Rachel felt the weight of the attention settle on her like dust. She breathed in through her nose, held it for 4 counts, and looked down at her folded hands. The skin was scarred in places, burned in one spot along her knuckles from a heating element she'd grabbed without thinking 2 days ago. Muscle memory from a life she was supposed to have forgotten. One of the nurses raised her hand. "I'll take the under. She's gone by Wednesday." "Bold," Hargrove said, his smile showing too many teeth. "I'm going with Thursday end of shift." Final answer. The meeting continued. Bed assignments, staffing rotations, a memo about the new electronic charting system that someone had already broken. Rachel took notes in her precise handwriting, the same handwriting that documented medication times, vital sign changes, and supply inventory discrepancies with the kind of meticulous attention that made supervisors nervous. She didn't know it yet, but those notes were building a case, a careful, undeniable record of the inflated supply orders, the unusual vendor codes, the billing amounts that didn't match deliveries. She was documenting evidence of a kickback arrangement worth $430,000 a year, and Dr. Hargrove was beginning to understand that she needed to disappear before she figured out what she was looking at. That afternoon, Rachel pushed her tray through the cafeteria line. Turkey sandwich on wheat, a side of soup, water. Careful food. Forgettable food. The kind of meal that didn't leave a mess if you spilled it. She was walking past the doctor's table when Hargrove rose from his seat with the casual precision of a man performing for an audience. He turned directly into her path, his shoulder connecting with her tray like a linebacker hitting a tackling dummy. The impact was deliberate. Calculated. The tray tipped. The soup exploded across the tile floor in a slow-motion scatter of liquid and ceramic, spreading across a 6-foot radius in an orange-red stain that looked like something worse than soup. The sandwich followed. The water glass shattered against the corner of a table. The entire cafeteria went silent. Not the comfortable silence of people eating lunch, but the sharp, electric silence of an audience recognizing a moment it would remember. Heads turned. Eyes locked onto Rachel. Onto Hargrove. Onto the mess spreading across the floor like an accusation. "Watch where you're going, sweetheart," Hargrove said, his voice pitched loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. He didn't apologize. Didn't even look directly at her. He simply smoothed his blazer and turned back to his conversation as if a temp nurse's lunch scattered across the floor was an atmospheric condition, something beneath acknowledgement. Rachel knelt down. Her knees found the damp tile. She began gathering the pieces of ceramic, moving with the kind of efficient precision that comes from having cleaned up worse than this, much worse, in rooms lit by the flash of explosions, under fire, with teammates bleeding out in sandstorms that turned everything the color of rust. A single tear escaped down her cheek. Not from sadness. Not from humiliation. From the sheer effort of not moving, not acting, not becoming the person she'd been trained to be. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove. His gaze had finally shifted toward her, curious to see if the temp would break, cry, or retreat to a supply closet like the others had done before. She didn't. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, Doctor," she said, her voice steady as bedrock, each word enunciated with the precision of someone used to being heard across gunfire. Some of them even survived. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence where you could hear the cafeteria refrigerators humming in the kitchen. Where you could track the individual beats of a nearby heart monitor bleeding through from the ER. Where the only sound was the soft patter of soup dripping from the edge of a table onto the floor below. Hargrove's jaw tightened. A small muscle flickered along the hinge. His eyes narrowed by degrees so subtle that only someone trained to read micro-expressions would have noticed. But he noticed. She'd just crossed a line he hadn't expected anyone to cross. She hadn't broken. Hadn't apologized. Hadn't scattered like the others. Instead, she'd answered him with something that sounded like a warning. He turned away and walked back to his table, his movements fractionally stiffer than before. The conversations resumed slowly, quietly, like machinery grinding back to life after a power surge. Rachel finished cleaning. Someone from the kitchen staff came out with a mop, moving with the practiced grace of people who'd been trained to show up and stay invisible. Rachel returned to the line, got another sandwich, another soup. Same meal. Same precision. She ate standing at a counter near the back, where no one would see her, where she could taste the salt and nothing else. 2 hours later, at shift change, Hargrove found her in the hallway near the medical records room. His timing was deliberate. The hallway was empty, just the two of them and the hum of the fax system pushing climate-controlled air through metal ducts. He held a patient chart in his right hand, and his expression carried the smile of someone who'd been waiting for his moment. Torres, he said, and there was something different in his voice now. Not the theatrical disdain of the cafeteria, but something colder. Something that had calculation underneath it. You might want to review your attention to detail. He tossed the chart toward her feet. Not dropped it. Tossed it. The paper scattered across the tile floor like snow, fanning out in disorganized clusters that would take minutes to reassemble and sort back into order. He was testing her. Seeing how she'd respond when publicly humiliated twice in one day. Rachel took one measured breath. She bent down, her movements precise and unhurried, and began gathering the pages. She didn't snatch at them or rush. She picked them up methodically, placing them in careful stacks, noting the page numbers as she went. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. The only thing that betrayed anything was the slight pause she took before speaking. "I'll have it reviewed, documented, and corrected within the hour, sir," she said, her voice level and professional. A temp nurse speaking to her attending physician. Nothing more. Nothing that would give him the satisfaction he was hunting for. Something flashed across his face, anger, maybe, or frustration at not getting the response he wanted. She'd just demonstrated that she could absorb humiliation, that she wouldn't break, that his leverage was thinner than he'd thought. He turned on his heel and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the sharp precision of someone moving faster than they intended to, a man who'd lost the thread of control he usually held so tightly. Rachel gathered the last of the papers and stood. She held the chart against her chest and looked down at the scattered pages. That was when something shifted in the back of her mind, a small alarm, barely perceptible but growing. She'd been reading these charts all week, documenting medication times, supply usage, billing codes. She'd been looking at patterns the way she'd been trained to read patterns in battlefield intelligence, asking which numbers didn't match, which orders looked unusual, which vendors appeared in the system with frequencies that didn't align with actual usage. And everything she'd seen painted a picture of something systematic. Something organized. Something worth protecting. That evening, as she clocked out of her shift, the rain had started. The kind of Portland rain that wasn't dramatic, no thunder, no lightning, just a steady, patient downpour that soaked through everything given enough time. Rachel sat in her car in the parking lot, watching the precipitation stream down her windshield, her hands still on the steering wheel. Around her, the hospital lights glowed through the water-stained glass like a beacon in the darkness. Somewhere inside Oak Creek Memorial, Dr. Hargrove was likely reviewing the day, calculating his next move, understanding that the temp nurse with the meticulous charting and the steady composure was a problem that needed solving before she pieced together what she was actually documenting. She had no idea what was about to walk through those hospital doors and change everything. The rain came sideways Thursday night, hammering the ambulance bay windows as the paramedics wheeled in their John Doe, 23-year-old male, unconscious, bleeding from a motorcycle accident on Highway 26, no wallet, no phone, no identification. The ER erupted into controlled chaos. Trauma Bay 3. Saline running wide open. Somebody yelled for typo negative. The smell of diesel fuel and wet asphalt mixed with antiseptic as Rachel Torres moved through the controlled violence of a trauma activation, her temp nurse badge catching light under the fluorescence, her hand steady as surgical lasers as she cut away the patient-soaked leather jacket. That's when she found them. Dog tags tangled in the torn fabric, matted with blood and rainwater. Rachel's hand stilled. She lifted them carefully, water dripping onto the stainless steel bay. The engraved letters caught the overhead light. She froze, her breath catching somewhere between her ribs and her throat, though her face remained perfectly still, her expression locked behind the mask she'd learned to wear 20 years ago in a compound in Ramadi. The name read, Karim Medina. Army Ranger. Blood type O positive. The words blurred slightly as her vision narrowed to a single point. Karim Medina. She'd pulled a terrified 8-year-old boy from a collapsed building in Jolan district with that exact name. The child had been trapped for 4 hours beneath concrete and rebar while firefights erupted in the streets above. She'd carried him to the field hospital, a uniform soaked with his blood and her own, her hands gentle despite the chaos, whispering in broken Arabic that he was safe now, that an American medic named Torres had him. She'd watched him cling to her neck like she was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to dust and shrapnel. Then her unit had extracted. Then her records had vanished. Then she'd disappeared. The 8-year-old boy on the stretcher was now a ranger with her name embedded in his life. Literally embedded. He'd taken the surname of the medic he believed had died saving him. Pressures dropping, the attending announced. Get him upstairs to ICU. 2 units of packed red cells, cross and match for 4 more. Move. Rachel moved. She processed the admission papers herself, volunteered for the Friday morning shift, the Friday night shift, the Saturday morning shift. Her supervisor, Marcus Webb, who'd worked ER for 18 years and knew better than to ask questions, simply nodded and penciled her in. ICU was understaffed. Her availability was convenient. What he didn't know was that Rachel hadn't slept in 36 hours, and the only thing anchoring her to the present tense was the steady rhythm of the monitors beeping in room for 12. Karim remained unconscious through Friday. His condition was stable but guarded. Traumatic brain injury from blunt force. Compound fracture of the left tibia. Grade 3 liver laceration. The kind of injuries that meant a week minimum in ICU, maybe longer. His chart noted no next of kin, no emergency contact, no medical history on file because he had no identity, just like when he was 8, trapped under concrete with a name written on a hospital bracelet in a language he barely understood. She remembered his eyes when he finally woke in the field hospital. Brown eyes. Dark as river stones. Terrified and trusting at the same time. Dr. Hargrove noticed her unusual attachment to the John Doe patient by Friday afternoon. He'd watched her volunteer for the ICU rotation while other nurses fought to stay in ER, less critical work, easier charting. He'd observed her sitting beside the unconscious ranger's bed during her breaks instead of eating, studying his face like she was decoding a classified memo. At 2:13 p.m. on Friday, Hargrove made 3 phone calls. The first was to Patricia Chen, Oak Creek Memorial's board member and Hargrove's golf partner. Bit concerned about our temp nurse, he said, his voice measured and concerned, the voice of a man with integrity. She's emotionally compromised. Fixating on a trauma patient. Shows signs of poor professional boundaries. That kind of thing leads to medication errors, charting mistakes, liability exposure. Thought you should know. Patricia made a note. The second call went to Mike Stevens in HR, getting worried about Rachel Torres's background check, Hargrove said. 10-year employment gap that doesn't quite add up. Military service listed but records seem redacted? I'd hate to think we hired someone with undisclosed credentialing issues. Might want to have our investigator take another look. Just being thorough. Mike pulled her file. The third call was to the hospital's credentialing verification officer, a simple request to double-check her military service records, her nursing licenses, anything that seemed unusual. Nothing accusatory. Just prudent. Just the kind of thing any responsible physician would do. Hargrove understood institutional leverage the way other men understood breathing. He wasn't going to confront her directly. He was going to isolate her, discredit her, make sure that when she slipped, and they always slipped, no one would believe her. He was constructing the framework for her destruction while she sat beside a patient's bed, watching his chest rise and fall with the mechanical rhythm of a ventilator, her hands folded in her lap so no one could see them shaking. But her hands weren't shaking. That was the mistake Hargrove made. He assumed emotional attachment meant weakness. He didn't understand that Rachel Torres had held dying men's hands in the dark while mortar fire shook the walls. Emotional attachment and operational clarity weren't opposites in her world, they were the same thing. She was sitting at Karim Medina's bedside because he was her patient, and her patients didn't die. Saturday at 3:14 a.m., the monitor alarm screamed. Rachel was already moving before consciousness caught up with her body. She'd been dozing in the chair beside his bed, her internal clock wired from 2 decades of military deployments where sleep was a luxury and alertness was survival. The alarm hit a frequency that bypassed thought and triggered pure reflex. His oxygen saturation, 78% and dropping. His chest rigid. His neck veins bulging like piano wire against his skin. His heart rate climbing from 88 to 118 to 142 in 7 seconds flat. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the thoracic cavity, collapsing his lung, compressing his heart, killing him in real time. Rachel grabbed the crash cart with her left hand and was already scanning for the supplies before her brain had finished naming the problem. 14-gauge needle angiocath. She had perhaps 3 minutes before cardiac arrest. The on-call attending was 2 floors down managing a septic patient. The resident was writing notes. There was no time to wait for authorization. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory written into her nervous system by 1,000 training hours, by operating in conditions where hesitation meant corpses. She counted ribs, 1, 2, 3. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The needle went in clean and smooth between the ribs like she was puncturing silk. The hiss. Air escaping from his chest cavity with a sound like a held breath finally released. The needle decompression. The most dangerous intervention she could perform without physician authorization. The thing that would end her nursing career if it went wrong. The thing that would save his life if the pressure didn't release. His oxygen saturation climbed. 78. 82. 88. 92. 95. The rigid tension in his chest wall softened visibly. His neck veins receded. His heart rate descended from the dangerous plateau, 140, 128, 112, 98. She'd just committed career suicide and saved a life in the same moment. The attending arrived 8 minutes later, found his patient stable with a needle sitting between the ribs, and didn't say a word. He simply documented the procedure, signed off on it as a life-saving emergency intervention, and walked back downstairs. He'd worked trauma long enough to recognize the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. You didn't question competence. You documented it and moved on. But Hargrove was going to question it. The call to the credentialing officer. The board member alert. The HR flag on her background. All of it was moving through the institutional machinery now, operating independently, designed to find exactly what he'd instructed them to find, evidence of someone who didn't belong. And now she'd performed an unauthorized procedure that, whatever its outcome, violated protocol. She'd given him exactly what he needed. Rachel sat back in the chair beside Karim Medina's bed as his chest rose and fell in normal rhythm again. His oxygen saturation held steady at 96%. His heart rate was climbing back into the realm of human physiology. She'd saved him. She'd broken every rule in the process. And somewhere in the hospital's administrative structure, invisible machinery was already turning. She pressed her forehead against the cold railing of the bed, her eyes closed, and breathed. Just a nurse who'd done her job. The chest went rigid. Karim's sternum heaved upward like something was fighting to escape from inside him, and Rachel saw it in the monitors before she saw it in his body, oxygen saturation dropping from 94 to 88 to 79, each number a countdown. His neck veins bulged purple against his skin, distended like cord someone had pulled too tight, and his jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle tremors from across the ICU bed. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, pushing air into lungs that couldn't accept it, and the pressure built until the monitors screamed. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, crushing the lung, collapsing the heart's ability to fill. Minutes to death if she didn't move. Rachel didn't wait for Dr. Ashford's order. Didn't wait for the attending. Moved to the crash cart, her hand steady as a surgical laser, and grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the trauma tray. The needle was long and silver and exact, designed for this single moment, and she felt the weight of it against her palm like muscle memory was pulling her hands into position before her conscious mind caught up. She'd done this in Ramadi on a 19-year-old Marine whose lung had collapsed from an IED fragment. She'd done it in a Black Hawk during a dust-off with rounds coming through the fuselage. Her hands knew this procedure the way other people's hands knew how to tie shoelaces. She swabbed Karim's chest with antiseptic, the acrid smell rising up between them, and positioned the needle at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the textbook location, the place anatomy had designed for this exact intervention. The other nurses watched her move. Nobody stopped her. The ICU at 3 in the morning had a particular quality of isolation, a sense that the regular rules were suspended when it was just machines and monitors and the sound of a human being suffocating in front of you. Dr. Ashford stood frozen at the bedside, his mouth open, his hands at his sides, watching as Rachel did the thing he was trained to do but hadn't thought to do fast enough. She inserted the needle between Karim's ribs. Felt the pop of the intercostal fascia giving way. And then the hiss, that unmistakable sound of trapped air escaping at pressure, a whisper that meant survival, meant pressure equalizing, meant the lung could re-expand and the heart could beat without obstruction. The monitors responded in real time. Oxygen saturation climbed. 84. 88. 92. The neck veins collapsed back to normal. The rigid chest relaxed. Karim's breathing synchronized with the ventilator instead of fighting it. 20 seconds. That's what it took to pull him back from the edge of death. Rachel left the needle in place, proper protocol, and stepped back, charting the time and the procedure and the clinical response with the methodical precision that had become her armor since arriving at Oak Creek Memorial. The vitals stabilized. The monitors settled into their steady rhythm. Karim Medina, age 27, survived the night because a temp nurse recognized the sound of dying and moved without hesitation. Dr. Hargrove arrived 6 minutes later. She heard his shoes on the tile first, sharp, aggressive footsteps that didn't belong to the usual night staff, and then she saw him in the doorway, his jaw tight, his face the color of old concrete. He'd been called by the code notification, summoned from wherever he spent his nights, and he'd driven here with some expectation of cleanup, some assumption of protocol violation that he could weaponize. What he found instead was a stabilized patient and a temp nurse standing at the bedside with a completed emergency procedure charted in pristine detail. His eyes went to Karim first. To the chest tube. To the monitors showing normal pressures. Then to Rachel. Who authorized that procedure? His voice came out like a knife being drawn, slow, deliberate, designed to cut. Rachel looked at him without blinking. The patient was dying, doctor. Tension pneumothorax. Trapped air, collapsing the lung. Needle decompression was indicated. That's not what I asked. Hargrove stepped into the room, his presence making the air pressure change, making it harder to breathe. You're a temp nurse. Temporary. Day-to-day contract. You don't perform invasive procedures without an attending's explicit order. You don't crack protocols because you think you know better. This is grounds for immediate termination. Rachel's hands were steady. The patient's oxygen saturation was 79 and dropping. He was minutes from cardiac arrest. Protocol exists to guide practice, not to prevent necessary intervention when a patient is dying. You don't get to interpret protocol. Hargrove's voice dropped lower, which somehow made it worse. You get to follow it. And what you just did is exactly the kind of reckless, unsupervised practice that gets hospitals sued and people killed. I'm making some calls. He turned and walked out of the ICU at 11 minutes past 3 in the morning, his phone already in his hand. Rachel knew what the calls would be. She'd seen the pattern play out in her years before everything went classified, before her records were sealed and buried, before she'd learned to expect betrayal from institutional power structures. Hargrove would call the board chair. She'd heard his name mentioned in the cafeteria once, some man named Sterling who handled the hospital's finances and had a reputation for protecting the doctors who made the place profitable. He'd tell Sterling about the reckless temp with the suspicious employment gap, the one who'd performed an authorized surgery, the one whose hiring maybe hadn't been fully vetted because she'd been brought in through an agency instead of HR. He'd make it sound like negligence, like a hiring failure that Sterling himself had allowed to happen. Then HR. Within an hour, he'd have called the Director of Human Resources and filed a formal complaint, complete with fabricated details about prior incidents that had never occurred, creating a paper trail that would make her suspension look inevitable rather than vindictive. And he'd bring in an investigator, she was certain of it, could feel the calculation happening in real time, someone from outside the hospital who specialized in credentials review and employment verification, someone who would spend 2 days asking questions about her background and her gap years and her right to even be holding a stethoscope. The night shift continued. Rachel checked Karim's vitals at 0:45 and 03:15, documented each assessment, and sat in the break room at 5 in the morning with cold coffee and the knowledge that everything she'd built in 17 days at Oak Creek Memorial was about to collapse. Her keycard was deactivated at 6:58 a.m. She knew because she tried to unlock the staff bathroom and heard the magnetic click of rejection, the quiet sound of institutional doors closing. By 7:20, a woman from HR named Patricia stood in the administrative office holding a folder and a prepared statement. Suspended pending investigation. Disciplinary review scheduled for Monday. An outside investigator had been contracted to review her credentials and her employment history. She was not to enter patient care areas during the suspension period. Security would escort her to her locker and then to the exit. The rain started as they walked her through the corridors. She could see it through the windows, falling hard, hammering the parking lot like something was angry at the pavement. Security, a woman named Carla who'd always been kind, who'd always made eye contact, walked beside her in silence, embarrassed by her job, by what she'd been instructed to do. At her locker, Rachel gathered her things in less than 2 minutes. One picture of Marcus in uniform, still in its frame. Her personal copy of her emergency contact sheet. The worn pair of combat boots that had belonged to her husband, the leather creased from 20 years of military ops, the soles worn down from deserts and mountains and the kind of terrain that tried to kill you every day. She pressed those boots against her chest and walked out into the rain. Riverside Cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the city, a place of manicured grass and marble stones and the quiet knowledge that everyone here had finished their last mission. Marcus Torres, Navy SEAL, KIA 2018, his name carved into granite, simple and exact and utterly insufficient for the man it commemorated. Rachel knelt in the mud beside his grave, her work clothes already soaked through, and pressed her forehead against the cold stone. "I promised you," she whispered. The rain hammered down around her, cold and relentless. "I promised I'd keep my head down. That I'd stay disappeared like they ordered after Ramadi. That I'd be quiet and small and invisible and we'd have this one thing, this simple life where I was just a nurse and you were just gone and that was the end of the story." Her hands shook as she placed the combat boots against the headstone, aligning them the way Marcus would have aligned them, precise and ceremonial. "But I couldn't let that boy die twice, Marcus. I couldn't. He was going to die because a man with money and connections decided I was more valuable as a warning than as a person. And I've never been good at accepting that trade. You knew that." You knew I'd eventually choose what's right over what's safe. She sat in the mud and rain until late afternoon, until her body had gone numb and the rain had soaked through every layer of clothing she owned. The cemetery around her was silent except for the sound of water falling, and somewhere in that silence, she made a decision. She'd given up her name once before. She'd surrendered her identity to the military and the black sites and the operations that never officially happened. She'd done it again when Hargrove arrived, when she'd accepted his humiliation and his contempt without breaking, when she'd kept her hand steady and her voice level and her past buried so deep that no one could find the woman who'd been decorated for valor. But that woman was still in there. Still alive. Still dangerous when people she loved were dying. By 6 in the morning, security was already waiting at her locker. Rachel had known it was coming, the moment Hargrove's face had darkened in that ICU doorway, the moment he'd activated his network with surgical precision, she'd known. Still, there was a specific kind of finality in watching 2 uniformed officers stand flanking the corridor while her keycard was deactivated, the badge clipped to her scrubs rendered inert. Just a plastic rectangle now. Just a reminder of how fast the ground could disappear. Hargrove watched from his office window 3 floors up, his silhouette backlit by fluorescent lights, arms crossed, satisfied the way a hunter is satisfied when the trap finally springs. He didn't need to say anything. His presence said everything. I warned you not to be useful. The rain started as she drove through Portland's pre-dawn darkness, the kind that hammered windshields like applause, like the city itself was celebrating her erasure. She navigated the cemetery roads by muscle memory, pulled into the lot where Marcus had been sleeping for 11 years and 43 days, to be precise, and knelt on the wet grass without bothering with the maintenance path. Her scrub soaked through instantly. The cold didn't matter. The rain didn't matter. What mattered was the marble headstone and the name carved into it and the impossible weight of a promise she'd broken. I was supposed to stay disappeared, she whispered, her forehead pressed against the stone that was wet and smooth and cold as a sniper's scope. You made me promise. Keep your head down, keep us safe, let them think you're dead. That's what you said before Kandahar. That's what you said every time I wanted to fight. Every time I wanted to be useful. You said being alive was enough, being quiet was survival, being forgotten was love. Her hands gripped the wet grass. But I couldn't let that boy die twice, Marcus. I couldn't. The rain hammered harder. And now I've got nothing left to hide behind. She reached down and pulled the worn combat boots from her bag, Marcus's boots, the leather cracked and creased from 20 years of weight, the sole scuffed from tarmac and sand and everything they'd walked through together. She'd kept them in the bottom of her locker all this time, the one object she'd refused to surrender when the military erased her file, the one physical proof that she'd been real. Someone had lived. Someone had loved. Someone had fought. She set them carefully against the headstone, heels touching the marble, and for the first time in a decade, she didn't reach down to take them back. I'm done running, she said quietly. I'm done waiting for permission to exist. The military convoy rolled into Oak Creek Memorial's ambulance bay at 7:05, when the morning shift was just beginning their rounds and most of the hospital was still half asleep. 3 black SUVs with government plates, synchronized timing, the kind of precision that made every nurse and resident stop what they were doing. Then the helicopter, a UH-60M Black Hawk with the rotor wash shaking the windows hard enough to rattle medication carts. It touched down on the rooftop helipad like it owned the building, because it did. Karim Medina opened his eyes in the ICU to see soldiers filing through the door in dress uniforms, boots hitting the tile in unison, and his entire body went rigid except for his hands, which trembled. Senior Chief. His voice cracked like a teenager's, and he was a man now, 6'2", shoulder width that filled the hospital gown, face scarred from shrapnel, but in that moment he was 8 years old again, calling down from a collapsed building in Ramadi while the air tasted like copper and smoke. Senior Chief Torres? That's really you. The lead officer, Major Sarah Holloway, 75th Ranger Regiment, bearing the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, opened the belongings bag from Karim's motorcycle crash. Standard procedure. Recovery process. except her hand stilled when she pulled out a folder marked classified in red letters, and she opened it slowly, the way you handle something that might detonate. Inside, Rachel's service record. All of it. The parts that officially didn't exist. Kareem, the major said quietly, not looking away from the folder. Can you confirm for me, did you ever meet Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres in Ramadi, 2003? She saved my life, Kareem whispered. Pulled me out of a building. I was 8. She told me her name was Marcus before she handed me to the medical team. I thought she was a man until I was 13 and figured it out. I took that name anyway. To honor her. Because I thought his voice broke. I thought she died. Major Holloway began to read aloud, each citation landing like a sniper round. Bronze Star for Valor Under Fire, 2001. She paused. The room was so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze. Silver Star, Operation Anaconda, 2002. Another pause. Kareem's eyes filled with tears. Defense Superior Service Medal, Task Force 121, 2003, awarded for leading an operation resulting in the recovery of 847 civilian hostages from a black site that this government will never officially acknowledge. Major Holloway looked up from the folder. 2 additional Silver Stars. One in 2004, one in 2005. Commendation for legend status within JSOC circles before she vanished from all records in 2006. The door opened and Special Agent Catherine Ross stepped through, FBI credentials visible, eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic, authority radiating from her like heat, followed by a quiet Marine Corps veteran named David Chen, who carried a laptop like it was a precision instrument. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, Agent Ross said, and Hargrove had appeared in the doorway without anyone noticing, drawn by the sound of helicopters and federal authority. We've been investigating Oak Creek Memorial's billing practices for the past 6 months. We needed someone with meticulous documentation skills to provide evidence without knowing they were doing it. Senior Chief Torres's charts have given us everything we need. Every kickback arrangement with MedSource Solutions. Every inflated surgical supply order. Every scheme you've been running for 3 years and 8 months. Hargrove's face drained of color like someone had pulled a plug. We'd like to discuss your supply-vendor relationships, Agent Ross continued, her voice smooth as a knife. Specifically, the kickback arrangements totaling approximately $340,000 over 18 months. Would you like to call your lawyer, or would you like to tell us why you're not in handcuffs already? This is outrageous, Hargrove whispered. I want my lawyer. That's your right, Agent Ross nodded. We also need to discuss why you attempted to delete 6 months of security footage and patient charts from the hospital server at 6:56 a.m. this morning. David Chen stepped forward. His uniform had been pressed this morning with military precision. His bearing had been honed through 4 tours of active service. When he spoke, his voice was steady as surgical steel. Dr. Hargrove logged into the system using his administrative credentials and attempted to permanently delete files related to supply orders, surgical schedules, and nurse documentation. I saved every frame and reported the attempted destruction to the FBI at 7:15 a.m. He met Hargrove's eyes. Marines don't let Marines down. And we sure as hell don't let senior chiefs down either. Hargrove's expensive watch caught the light as his hands began to shake. The board chair, a man Hargrove had been courting for months, buying dinners, whispering promises, asked him to surrender his hospital credentials immediately. The HR director he'd been feeding false complaints to step backward, suddenly very interested in his shoes. The outside investigator, already sensing which way the wind was blowing, was already somewhere else. By Monday, he'd been placed on administrative leave pending criminal investigation. By Tuesday, charges were filed: healthcare fraud, federal kickback violations, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering. His medical license suspended indefinitely. His network, the careful structure of reciprocal favors and institutional power he'd spent 3 years building, disintegrated in 72 hours because it had been built on sand and corruption, not competence. Rachel was reinstated by Wednesday morning with a formal apology from the hospital CEO, back pay for the hours she'd been suspended, and an offer of a permanent position at Oak Creek Memorial that she declined politely. She had other plans. 18 months later, she'd be walking past a strip mall on Portland's east side and she'd see him sitting at a folding table beneath a faded banner reading affordable supplemental insurance, ask me how. His expensive watch would be gone, replaced by something from a clearance bin. His tailored shirts would be wrinkled polo material. His hands would shake as he held brochures that nobody took, trying to catch the attention of passers-by who looked through him like he was glass. When their eyes met for one brief second, she wouldn't stop, wouldn't speak, just continued walking to her car because he was already dead, just living still. She drove to the Portland VA hospital, where she now served as chief nursing officer, overseeing care for 3,000 veterans. In her office, Kareem's dog tags hung in a shadow box on the wall beside Marcus's worn combat boots, that pair she'd set against the headstone in the rain, that he'd somehow made sure were returned to her after the military arrived, understanding what they meant. Kareem himself had sent her a letter that sat framed on her desk. You saved me twice, Senior Chief. Once when I was too young to thank you. Once when I couldn't speak at all. I carry your husband's name with pride. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your history, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let us know, would you have revealed yourself, or would you have stayed hidden? And if you want more stories about the quiet heroes walking among us, hit that notification bell. We'll see you next time.